Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Hello, welcome to 5 to Thrive Live, a podcast about thriving for those who have been affected by cancer and chronic disease. I'm Dr. Lisa Schuler, and I co-host with my good friend Carolyn Gazella. You can find all of our past podcasts on every major podcast outlet, and you can also find a schedule on our website, ithriveplan.com. So tonight, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Celia Hildebrand about the East Asian perspective on trauma. Dr. Hildebrand earned a master and a doctorate degree in acupuncture and Oriental medicine. Dr. Hildebrand has lived with purpose defined by heart, hands, skill, and intention. She's fellowship faculty with the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, and she recently developed a full-time practice with the U.S. Veterans Administration, seeing 40 to 60 patients a week. She is the recipient of a Fulbright Award in 2019, which took her to Ukraine to teach acupuncture for pain, post-traumatic stress disorder, and trauma. And she continues to expand this curriculum, and that's resulted in more than 135 people using these tools to help heal through varying degrees of trauma. Much of that kind of trauma, a few of us in the U.S. will experience, but we are going to talk about trauma and how this East Asian perspective is so relevant. So before we do that, though, I do want to thank our sponsors. First, we have Cetria, a patented form of glutathione, clinically proven to raise glutathione levels. Glutathione is the master antioxidant and the body's primary defense against free radicals. It also helps to support respiratory health, and you can learn more at cetriaglutathione.com. We also thank Cognizin Citicoline, which is nature's way of keeping the brain firing on all cylinders. So if you want to enhance your brain function, your memory, focus, and attention, look for Cognizin on the label, and you can learn more at cognizin.com. And as a matter of fact, Pro Thrivers Wellness Brain, which is part of the Pro Thrivers Wellness suite of products, is a product that contains Cognizin as well as some other brain-supporting nutrients and herbs. And you can find Pro Thrivers Wellness Brain online at pureformulas.com. And Dr. Ohhira's Probiotics, a best-selling probiotic for over 30 years, contains 12 probiotic strains, which are shelf-stable without refrigeration due to a unique 3-year fermentation process. And you can learn more at drohhiraprobiotics.com. So with that, Dr. Hildebrand, welcome to 5 to Thrive Live.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here.
Indeed. I'm delighted that you are here as well. So, you've been to the Ukraine to offer East Asian medicine to ease the trauma that's experienced by many there. Why have you gone there so many times?
Well, first of all, I am Ukrainian. I'm second generation. My mother and her entire family are from Ukraine. They came over in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. So I was raised in the tradition of the Ukrainian culture, the language, everything, the practices, the spirituality. And so I felt a very deep calling. I've been going back and forth to Ukraine since about 2004 to find my family, meet them, and reestablish bridges with them. So I figured this was a really good opportunity. When I was given the Fulbright, especially, it was an opportunity to create a program that would allow kind of a foundation for me to return over and over again to Ukraine and teach and be part of the culture there.
Yeah. Well, that's really a beautiful way of giving back, actually. So let's talk about this, because you're obviously well-trained in East Asian medicine, which for some of our listeners, they may be wondering, what is this? And if they're familiar with this space, we used to use the terminology traditional Chinese medicine, but we've moved to East Asian because it's actually more than just Chinese. So that's one thing I wanted to clarify up front. But so you've had deep training in East Asian medicine. And so let's start with the physical impacts of trauma from that East Asian perspective?
Okay, I'm going to kind of go back and forth between East and Western medicines with this.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma comes in different forms, right? It can be both physiological, but it can be an emotional. It can be a primary trauma where I am impacted. I'm either falling, I've been hit, I've had an accident, I've had a bad experience, I've been emotionally abused, and it can be secondary. So the secondary trauma is observing something that's happened to another person. Most of us were impacted, for example, at 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
All of us are impacted when we see the visions on the television shows or in the movies, when we see people being hurt or explosions and things like that. That is a form of secondary trauma. Trauma comes to us in many layers and many ways, and mostly in East Asian medicine, we think about it as coming in through our weight qi, and that's spelled WEIQI, weight qi, which is our protective qi, and that's the qi that kind of envelops our physical bodies, and some people also think in terms of our emotional bodies, and that protective qi is what keeps us safe from it's our immune system. In other words, it keeps us safe from the germs, the bacteria, the viruses, the fungus, the things that enter our body in any way, whether they come in through an open wound, a cut, or any of our orifices. Orifices are important in terms of trauma. We see things, we hear them, we smell them, we taste them. And each one of those orifices represents a pathway into our psyche and into our physical body. And East Asian medicine has a way of looking at that as something enters our physical body or our emotional body, and how our psyches and our physical bodies metabolize that, digest it, and move with it.
So that brings up my next question. So you mentioned metabolize, which, in a truly sort of physiological sense means you basically take something and you digest it and then you eliminate it. So when you say metabolize, like from an East Asian perspective, do these physical effects that are taken up by the body, either, having physical or psychological components, do they stay for a long time, or do they just go through?
That's a really good question. And I can contextualize that by talking about yin and yang, which is another concept and construct of East Asian medicine. Mm-hmm. Yin and yang represent opposites, dualities maybe, but they also represent one within the other. The transformation of yin to yang and yang back into yin, and the fact that there is one element of yang within the larger picture of yin, and there's an element of yin within the yang. And that's, that can sound very confusing. The most important principle here is that there's always a transformation. There's always a phase at which one thing turns into another. That's a transformation, a cellular metabolism, that's a thought process, that is a digestive process of life and of food and liquid. So this entire concept of moving forward, moving through something, is how each one of us individually and probably collectively move through trauma. So where I might get stuck in trauma could be based in one of my organ systems or one of my electrical systems or my nervous system. Where you might get stuck with something moving through trauma could be through a physiological thing, maybe through a muscle or a blood vessel. So we all have these different ways of how we metabolize it, but also how we take in an experience and then how we move through it.
Mm-hmm. So what about the psychological effects? I think we would say in the Western science of things that people have psychological effects of trauma, particularly, say, childhood traumas that really can last a lifetime. So in many ways, they affect how we function in the world, some of which is physiological. It changes the way our neurological system works, for example, and how we respond to stressors later and things like that. But from an East Asian perspective, there's a sort of a philosophical component, the 5-element theory, which maybe helps us. Does it help us to understand how trauma affects us psychologically?
It does. And thank you for that softball that you just threw at me. That's a great softball. So the way it does is that there are the 5 elements that represent always, again, like a transformation. So if we just start with the element, for example, of fire. So fire is the element that is best represented, or is represented by the organ systems of the heart and the small intestine. How does fire even become fire? Is it comes from the element of wood. And wood, of course, is represented, is something that can burn. And there's the quality of the wood that depends on both the moisture and the nutrition within the wood, and whether it's too dry, in which case the wood will burn very, very hot, or if it's too soft, or if it's too moist, then it will take a longer time to burn. Wood is represented in it's the element that's represented within the liver and the gallbladder. So here we have the digestive organs, right? The ones that actually produce the bio and the enzymes that would digest and experience or digest food. So how does wood grow other than, so wood comes from the element before the wood would be water. So wood grows when there's enough water. Water is represented by the kidney and the urinary bladder. So can the wood absorb the water? Can the wood actually use the water once it's absorbed? What does it do with the water? Is it oversaturated, or is it not saturated enough? And that comes from the element of earth. So the earth is represented with the stomach and the spleen. So if the stomach and the spleen are actually these points of, if the earth itself, I should say, is very dry, it doesn't have enough water inside of the earth, so the wood really cannot hold it, cannot draw it up into its fibers. So when it burns very, very hot. Or if the earth is muddy, if it's swampy, because the earth element itself, the fibers of the soil are not able and capable of really holding on to the water for whatever reason, then the tree is not, or the wood is not going to be able to pick it up, or it might pick up too much of it, and then it won't burn properly into the fire. So where does this earth come from, and how does the earth hold on to these other pieces of it that help it to have the absorption ability for water? It comes from the metallic pieces within the earth. And the metallic piece is represented by the lung and the large intestine. So these elements all feed into each other, and they create a complete cycle. So if you go back to the fire is burning the wood that creates the earth. And within the earth, depending on how good the wood is to begin with, creates the earth, which is holding on to the minerals, which is part of the digestive process. And so you can see, like, this entire system is one of transformation. You have to be able to get from one element to the next in a healthy way, so that the entire circle of life, this is called the cycle, the generative cycle of life. With any one of these elements that are weakened, whether it's because of a physical or an emotional trauma, if there's a place where you cannot transform to the next level, is where this trauma begins to settle into the body or into the emotional states. Every organ system has an emotion related to it, a psychological emotion that can be related to it. For example, we talk about the emotion that's related to the heart and the small intestine. That we think about as being an overabundance, maybe a maniacal sense or an imbalanced sense of happiness and joy. When people are so joyful, like they're floating, they're just bouncing off the walls, they're that joyful. And that we think of as an imbalance within the heart and the small intestine. On the other side of that is this idea of sadness, which is embedded within the element of metal, which is the lungs and the large intestine. We talk about that because we often think about the sound of grief that's pouring out of a person who's sobbing. We think about that in terms of the lungs. So when we hear somebody who's always with this kind of very, very sobbing kind of voice, or somebody who breaks into tears a lot, we might think about a lung imbalance. Somebody that's kind of stuck within grief and can't move beyond something that's happened to them in the past. The element of the earth is more of the grounding, and it's more the sound of kind of a sing-song voice. There's this extra sweetness that maybe is not being well digested within the stomach and the spleen itself. And then when we get to the element of liver, so we're in the wood phase now, we think about people that are just where the wood is burning too hot or it's not burning hot enough, and it just creates this anger, this frustration. We can't get it out. We can't move it forward. We can't grow. Our roots aren't deep enough in the soil. We can't reach up to the sky. We can't grow. We're really too dry to be able to bend when the winds of change come to hit us. So that's how we think of people who are kind of stuck within an emotional or psychological stage. We'll do a process of a diagnosis, which will take us to look at which element might they be stuck in based on their psychological or their emotional responses to events that are happening.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that was an amazing summary of a system that people take many, many months, years to learn. So good job. And I'm wondering if I could just add that there's, you guys who are really well trained in East Asian medicine also take pulse and look at tongue, and you can help figure out which elements are imbalanced and how that's all showing up in somebody. Yeah,
exactly. I forgot to mention the element of the kidney and the urinary bladder, which is really important in terms of people being in trauma, and especially people that cannot let go of anxiety and fear, because this is the type of person who will also have an incredible response, a startle response. And when you think about adrenaline and cortisol, which are produced by the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney, it's not hard to imagine somebody who is stuck in this heightened state of anxiety all the time.
Right. Okay, so with all of that, you have a very elegant way of understanding how trauma is received, and then in turn how it affects the body, which in turn affects the physiology of the body and has sort of predictable patterns that are going to play out from that, which I would imagine then leads you to be able to figure out how to best support that person in resolving the trauma. So let's talk a little bit about treatment, and maybe let's start with auricular acupuncture. I know that's a bit of a odd place to start, but I think it's important because I know you do that a lot in the Ukraine, and it's something that's portable. It's very accessible for people. So for people listening, auricular acupuncture, it's using various tiny little needles, or even little balls that are taped to various acupuncture points in the ear, on the earlobe, is what we're talking about. So do better than I did. Describe what that is and how it helps people who have experienced trauma.
One of the beautiful things about the ear is that the tissues of the ear are developing. The ear is being, I should say, created as a fetus in the womb between weeks 5 and 20. It's the same time that all the other organ systems are being developed within the fetus. But importantly, the ear actually has tissues from all of the organ systems in the whole body. It also is innervated by nerves that are developing at the same time as the ear is. And so the ear represents a somatotropic map of the entire body. We found this out only recently, like in the 1950s, when there was a famous French doctor, MD, who was studying auricular acupuncture in China and realized that what he was being taught reminded him of an upside down or an inverted fetus. And so based on this very odd theory of placement of auricular points in the ear, as he was visualizing a fetus, he created a hypothesis of thinking about and testing. If I think that the lobe, for example, represents the head, or the head and therefore the brain of this fetus, then if I kind of crawl up through the cartilage in the inner ear, I find the spine and the spinal cord. And in fact, after decades of research, we now know that the ear really is a very solid and very reliable map of the entire body, from the structure, from the bones and muscles to the nerves and the internal organs, including the function as well as the movement of energy through the whole body is represented within the ear. So that's why we use it. That's why it's become so powerful, and it's been so well studied now by the Department of Defense and universities around the world, as well as researchers around the world, to how is it that we can use the ear to help people's bodies harmonize, to harmonize the nervous system and also the function of different organs.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe an example would be good. Can you just, you have so many because I've heard you talk about some of this, but maybe just give us an example, maybe from the Ukraine, of how impactful this can be for people.
It's humbling, really humbling. There are different protocols that we can use when we work on the ear, and we've also been teaching it for pediatric acupuncture as well, or acupressure. So it's extremely useful for children, as well as for people who are immobilized for any reason. Maybe they're immobilized because they've had a stroke, or they're in the hospital, they're in recovery, or they're in a rehab center. You can almost always, 99% of the time, you can actually get to the ear. And so you can treat the whole body by using the ear in this somatotropic mapping. So one really profound experience for me in Ukraine was working on somebody who had just come back from the war, and he was a commander, had been a commander for years, and had been just discharged because he was found to be beating up his soldiers. This is not unusual for people that have severe PTSD, especially in wartime, where there's a snap, an emotional snapping that happens. And in his case, he just became violent and a little bit paranoid about what was happening around him. And so he started beating on his own soldiers. He was immediately discharged. And the day he was discharged, he was brought to me for treatment. A little bit frightening, right? So one of the first things I did is I just established trust with him, in small ways. He was with people that trusted me as well, so that helped quite a bit. And I he hadn't slept for almost 72 hours, so he was maniacal. He was, he had that look about him that was just both terror, but also rage. And I placed these 5 needles in both of his ears, and he went to sleep immediately. I took the needles out about an hour later. He barely woke up when I took the needles out. It so calmed down his central nervous system immediately. It went directly to the points that impact the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So his heart rate immediately decreased, his oxygen levels increased, the endorphins increased, adrenaline and cortisol were reduced, and he was able to fall into a deep sleep. He slept that night for 12 hours. The next day, he found me again, and he wanted a treatment again. We were in a bar. We were already having dinner in a bar. He joined us at the bar. I treated him on a bench in the bar, in a noisy bar, because he knew the owners of the bar. They allowed this to happen. He fell asleep in the middle of the bar. I slept for another 2 hours, and then went home and slept for another 8 hours. And then the third day, he came back, and he wanted treatment again. And he was already a changed person. And I met him again a year later, and he was a completely changed person. He was meditating, doing yoga daily, and had really recovered himself to himself.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great. I mean, it's just, so helpful. And I'm looking at our time because I want to get a few other questions in here. So you talked about auricular acupuncture, which is incredibly powerful. I'm just wondering if you want to make a case for full body acupuncture, or maybe for our listeners, if they feel like they've had some trauma and they'd like to explore an East Asian perspective on it, how they would maybe make a decision, or should they even have to make a decision between, say, auricular acupuncture, full body acupuncture, something else?
Auricular acupuncture is extremely good for trauma. There's a protocol, it's called the National Acu-Detox Association, NADA protocol, which has been used, which was used in 9/11. It was actually begun on September 12th. After the explosions at the World Trade Center, there was a hospital down the corner that started its program to treat first responders and community members. 2 years later, they treated 40,000 patients using only the 5-needle NADA protocol for trauma. It's actually usually used for substance abuse, which is the same neural pathways as trauma. So finding a community acupuncture clinic that is working with NADA protocol would be very useful for anyone who would like to move forward with this. And the National Acu-Detox Association has a list of trainers as well as a list of providers on its website.
Great. That's super helpful for people. So kind of along those lines, is there something that people should look for when they're exploring this East Asian approach, again, through the lens of trauma, what should they look for in a practitioner, an acupuncturist, if they really want to drill down into addressing their trauma?
There are two ways. One is the nomenclature of capital L, capital A, small c. LAC represents somebody who has been through usually a 4-year training program to become a licensed acupuncturist. Those we often also do auricular acupuncture, so you'd be in pretty good hands for full body as well as auricular acupuncture. Medical doctors are trained sometimes to do the auricular trauma protocol, which is often through another protocol from the Helms Medical Institute. The auricular trauma protocol works extremely well for people in trauma, physical as well as emotional. And those are done by some medical providers, not all. Full body acupuncture works wonders, also just to help release the trauma and the stress throughout the body.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, gosh, this has been great. We just have enough time for you to, answer my last question, which is there anything else that you feel like our listeners should know?
Auricular acupuncture produces some amazing results. I encourage anybody who's experiencing trauma, from whether it's PTSD, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, to find somebody in your community that can work with you on it. It's silent. It's often delivered in a silent space without need to talk. Once you are accessing your nervous system knows where to take you and knows how to help you heal.
Great. That's great. Okay, so with that, where can our listeners find you? Do you have a website or anything to share?
I do. My website is called Polaris Institute of East-West Medical Studies, but you can find us on polarismedicalinstitute.org.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, expertise, and your spirit, and the actual giving that you do of yourself to people in need. And that wraps up this episode of 5 to Thrive Live. Again, we thank our sponsors, Celia Glutathione, the superior glutathione to support liver and immune health, Cognizin Citicoline to help enhance memory, focus, and attention, Dr. Ohhira's Probiotics, award-winning pre- and probiotic formulas and ProThrivers wellness supplements designed specifically for thrivers. Thank you all for joining us. May you each experience joy, laughter, and love. It's time to thrive, everyone. Have a great night.